The War of 1812 between the United States and Britain is often called the Forgotten War, or dismissed as a stalemate. But in reality, it was a narrowly contested conflict that could easily have tipped in America's favor with a few changes. What if the US had achieved a decisive victory against Britain in this often overlooked war? The entire trajectory of North America could have been drastically reshaped and potentially even altered the course of the Napoleonic Wars raging in Europe at the same time. Let's explore this dramatic alternative history scenario and its sweeping consequences. In our timeline, Britain's Canadian colonies eventually united into the sovereign nation of Canada in 1867. But with an American victory in 1812, this celebrated nation may never have come into existence as we know it. After being defeated, it's likely Britain would have been forced to cede most, if not all, of its Canadian territories to the United States as part of the peace settlement. Lands in Canada, such as Nova Scotia and the Hudson's Bay Company claims, would have passed into American control. Instead of forming an independent British dominion, these areas may have been absorbed into the United States as new states, territories, or sovereign indigenous lands. The provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and more could have become the newest additions to the American Union. This would have radically altered the cultural, political, and linguistic fabric of the region. Instead of the English-French dynamics that unfolded in our timeline, the territories may have been subject to more aggressive assimilation efforts into the American melting pot. The pockets of French-Canadian culture could have faced extreme pressure. Additionally, this likely would have disrupted or prevented altogether the subsequent westward expansion of British settlers into the prairies and ultimately British Columbia. So much of the geographic boundaries and demographics we know could have been redrawn by American expansion and settlement over time. Rather than the Commonwealth realms and First Nations relations that developed in our Canada, this region's path may have more closely tracked the turbulent incorporation of native lands and governance structures into the United States system. So, in this alternative timeline, the very existence of the nation of Canada as a unified sovereign state from the Atlantic to the Pacific may have been erased before it ever began. The cultures and peoples of this land would have had a drastically different trajectory interwoven into the narrative of American history instead. Incorporating part of Canada also would have greatly impacted the growth and development of the United States. An early, definitive victory over the British Empire in the War of 1812 would have been a massive assertion of American power and prestige on the world stage at a crucial moment in its young history as a nation. Having solidified its independence from Britain just a few decades prior, outright defeating the premier global superpower of the day would have immediately elevated the United States' international stature and emboldened its ambitions for expansion. With British military opposition neutralized across its northern frontier, the march of American settlers and conquest of native lands would likely have accelerated at a blistering pace across the continent. Manifest destiny could have become a reality much sooner. However, this continental expansion and incorporation of Britain's former Canadian territories may have dramatically exacerbated the already simmering tensions between the northern and southern United States over issues like slavery, representation, and the balance of power. Suddenly extending the nation's boundaries all the way up to the Arctic could have upended the established cadence of admitting new slave and free states in parallel. Political battles may have become intense over how to administer and populate these vast new swaths of land acquired from Britain. Economically and demographically, absorbing Canada's natural resources, industries, and predominantly non-slaveholding British-French settlers could have severely tilted the balance within the United States in favor of the industrializing North over the agrarian slave labor South. Such drastic impacts may have propelled the divisions over slavery to a head sooner, potentially altering the conditions and timeline of westward expansion, colonial oppression of native peoples, and ultimately the catalyst and players of the Civil War itself. So while an American victory in 1812 would have immediately confirmed its rising global clout, it may have also gravely destabilized the tenuous political equilibrium holding the Union together and hastened internal reckonings over its gravest contradictions as a nation. While the War of 1812 raged in North America, Britain was engaged in an existential struggle across the Atlantic, the Napoleonic Wars against revolutionary France. Losing its Canadian colonies to the United States could have drastically shifted the trajectory of this epic conflict. At the time, the British Empire was straining all its resources and manpower to counter Napoleon's continental ambitions. The requirement to reinforce its positions in Canada and potentially attempt to recapture territories from the US would have sapped Britain's military strength. Regiments, ships, funding, and colonial militias that could have been deployed against French forces may have had to be rerouted and bled into a new American front. This loss of concentrated British firepower could have provided the reprieve Napoleon needed at critical junctures. Key battles like Waterloo in 1815 that went against the French may have tilted the other way with British forces divided. Progress by American forces into Canada could have mirrored Wellington's Peninsular Campaign, giving Napoleon greater ability to mass his remaining forces. A distracted and diminished Britain may have also grown more disposed to eventually pursue a negotiated peace settlement with Napoleon on terms more favorable to French interests. Preserving its traditional continental rivals like Prussia may have taken a back seat to securing its colonial holdings. Conversely, however, a victorious and rising United States fresh off defeating the British Empire may have been emboldened to increase material support and aid to Britain to jointly bring down Napoleon. America's agricultural and economic engine could have provided a boost to its longtime French antagonists. In this alternative timeline, the US emerged as a pivotal power broker between Britain's fading dominance and Napoleon's radical militaristic ambitions for European mastery. The tides of warfare across multiple theaters could have fully reshaped the geopolitical trajectory of the entire era. One way or another, an American victory in 1812 would have profoundly impacted both Britain's ability to concentrate for the Napoleonic Wars and potentially altered the great powers' respective roles and stakes in that conflict's final resolution. As we can see, a decisive American victory in the often overlooked War of 1812 could have set off dramatic chain reactions reverberating across North America and the globe. The mere existence of Canada may have been erased. In turn, a political upheaval would have likely hit the United States years before the Civil War, and even in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars could have ended much differently. Ultimately, this pivotal 1812 scenario lays bare how quickly the maps of empires and the balances of power can be radically redrawn through the consequences of single conflicts across history.